the kind of new model of what prayer is, prayer and meditation, spiritual meditation, that really what you're doing is just spending a bit of time with God, or spending a bit of time with whatever spiritual being is important to you. And that's a kind of inner speech.
You mentioned, I want to go to, you mentioned dialogical inner thinking there. I want to go to this. What is your dialogical inner speech model?
Well, this really just stems from ideas that are there in Vygotsky's work, but because he died so tragically young, he wasn't able to see through. So I feel that, you know, a lot of my career has just been about trying to unpack some of those amazing insights. And it's there in what I've already said about how inner speech develops, that the idea that it develops out of a social dialogue between individuals, between, say, a mother and a child, a small child. That dialogue then gets taken on by the child so that she's having a conversation with herself in private speech, talking to herself. And then that becomes inner speech. But the crucial thing there is all the way along, all the way through that process is dialogic. So when we're talking to ourselves, we really are talking to ourselves. We're asking questions of ourselves and answering them in exactly the same kind of way as all those years before. We were being asked questions by a parent and we were then answering those questions. So it's really just an implication of, if that developmental model is right, then it follows that much of our inner speech should have that dialogic quality. And the work that we did starting 15 or so years ago, then the first paper was published, was to say, look, if you look at Vygotsky's theory, there should be these different kinds of inner speech. Nobody's ever tried to figure that out. Nobody's ever tried to assess them. Nobody's asked people, do you have these different kinds of inner speech? So we did that for the first time with our questionnaire, the Varieties of Inner Speech questionnaire, which then got revised. Has now been used in a whole bunch of different studies and translated into lots of different languages. And it's a handle on those different kinds of inner speech that I was talking about. You know, I think we need to not be thinking about inner speech as if it's just one thing, but rather thinking about the different forms that it takes. And the dialogicality bit of it is something that falls out of this scale. If you give it to people, it seems that they do respond to these items that are about whether the inner speech has this to and fro structure of a conversation. It seems to be a thing for a lot of people. There's huge individual difference, of course, but it is a thing, replicated in several different languages now. But it's what I've focused on, what that sort of buys in a cognitive sense. And I think the dialogicality of inner speech underpins something of the extraordinary flexibility and, let's say, open-endedness of human cognition. And that relates in turn to creativity and problem solving in all sorts of different ways. So to give the best example of that, you and I, neither of us knew where this conversation was going to go. Okay, you had some questions written down, you know, getting on for an hour ago. You had some questions written down, but we have covered ground that neither of us could have predicted. We didn't know where it was going to go because you didn't know what I was going to say and I didn't know what you were going to say. We have gone somewhere new. And, you know, this has been a brilliant conversation about inner speech. You know, I've had other conversations. They've all been different because we've never known where they're going to go. It's an endlessly creative, renewing process. And if you put that into your own head, and instead of processing, you know, crunching numbers in the way that an old-fashioned computer would just process some numbers, crunch some ones and zeros. Instead, what's going on is this endless process of questioning and answering, of taking a perspective on one's own cognition and responding to it as if that were another person. That, I think, opens up a lot of the wonder of human cognition to be creative, to be flexible, to be adaptive, to be open-ended, to not know where it's going until it gets there, and to make new things happen. And I think that's something that inner speech probably can do, maybe not uniquely, but because of language, because it's couched in language, it has that very powerful vehicle for doing that. So I can think a thought if we're going to use those terms, and I can respond to the thought, to the utterance, as if I were another person. And I think that's what allows me to be creative. It allows my thinking to be flexible, just in the same way that our social dialogues with other people are creative and flexible and open-ended.
Yeah. Yeah, really well said. How common is it that dialogue actually is another person or another self, like a simulated other person? And then I'm curious, again, I'm fascinated in all of the ways that people vary. Are there any cases where you've seen people having these 8-person round table discussions where each sort of identity in their mind actually has sort of a different perspective, a different personality, is able to come at something from a different angle? I'm curious, have you seen cases like that?
In terms of everyday, let's say ordinary cognition, non-pathological cognition, it's not something that's really very easy to document. And you'd be talking about case studies. I have lots of interesting correspondence with people who have all sorts of interesting ways in which their regular inner speech varies, but we don't really have any good scientific data on it yet. The question also shades very interestingly into questions that come up through clinical and abnormal psychology, psychopathology, and questions around therapy, where therapeutically it can be very valuable to think of the self as holding different positions and yourself being composed of different roles, different characters. That can be very helpful for therapists and their patients. It's slightly different. I mean, it's substantially different, really, in that what I've been proposing is a kind of cognitive developmental hypothesis about how thinking works and how brains get things done. It's not a theory of the self. It's not a therapeutic theory or anything like that. But I think there are very interesting points of commonality that would be really exciting to explore in future research.
Yeah.
And it's something that another one of the there's five factors that our questionnaire picks up. One of them is we call other people. And in this factor, basically people are assenting to, endorsing statements along the lines of, I hear other people's voices in my head, in my inner speech. And it's not as common as dialogicality, for example, but it is there. And it's really quite common to hear people say that they have conversations with other people in their heads, and kind of named, identifiable other people. And so their inner speech is a kind of internal dialogue between themselves and their boyfriend, or themselves and their mum, or themselves and another figure who isn't real, who is maybe no longer alive, or who was only ever fictional, or who was a fictional character, or a tulpa, or a game character, or a spiritual being. This has kind of led me to a kind of new model of what prayer is, prayer and meditation, spiritual meditation, that really what you're doing is just spending a bit of time with God, or spending a bit of time with whatever spiritual being is important to you. And that's a kind of inner speech.
Yeah. Because I'm pretty sure I can hold conversations with other people that I know in my life, that I have models of, and I sort of know their personality through interaction. And I'm pretty sure I can hear in their voice. It's not extremely clear, but I'm pretty sure I can hear a little bit in their voice, or at least there's some kind of accent coming across. And I think I can model their perspective. It might not be accurate all the time, of course, because I'm filling in blanks and kind of guessing. I think I can do that with one other person, but I don't think I can do it with two. Or I might be able to sit down and really, if I put a lot of focus and attention in it, do it with two. So I'd just be super curious what it looks like to find people that, have these very rich conversations with multiple people. And you bring up a very interesting point as well on where the boundaries are with that, and where does it get pathological? Where does that become hallucinatory? And is there a form of hallucination that isn't pathological? Can you hear other voices but it not give you any negative emotion? Like, can you have all these other voices in your mind that you model and talk to, but it not have any negative effect? Like, it's only positive? So many questions here. I know I just threw like 5 at you, but I think there's just so many really interesting. I don't know. Speak broadly about that. What have you seen this in your work?
Yeah, we've done research on exactly that topic. So it used to be assumed that hearing voices was always a sign of pathology. It used to be assumed that hearing voices was always a sign of schizophrenia, which is a scientifically problematic construct in the first place in terms of how it hangs together. Schizophrenia is probably a bunch of quite different things that somehow cluster together in clinical contexts. We know that hearing voices is associated with a whole range of other psychiatric diagnoses. In fact, it's quite hard to find one which is not associated in some way with hearing voices. But then beyond the realms of the psychiatric clinic, we know that a substantial minority of people hear voices quite regularly and are not troubled by them, find them neutral or actively positive. And this is something that's grown in the last, again, 15, 20 years, this recognition that there is this group of people out there who are hearing voices all the time, and quite complex voices and multiple voices in some cases, but they're not bothered by them. They don't seek psychiatric help. They're not distressed, so they don't need psychiatric help. Give you one example of a group of people that we've worked with. These are spiritualists. So they're people who experience interacting with the voices, the spirits of people who are deceased. In the UK, they're actually an organized religion. In other cultures, they're a bit more fringe, but they're a church in the UK. And we've worked with people from these churches in a really constructive way to understand what those kinds of auditory experiences are like and what effects they can have and how they can come to be non-distressing for people. So that would be one group of people who are interesting to work with. Another group of people who are not, I'm not suggesting are mentally ill at all, just as the spiritualists are not mentally ill, are writers, fiction writers. So typically writers of novels that we've worked with, but you could think of any kind of fiction, and probably you could take this into films and video games and as well. But we've worked with professional novelists and asking them this cliche, this kind of truism that writers hear the voices of their characters or have to hear the voices of their characters in order to get started with a book. Is there anything in that? Is it really like hearing a voice? And we've done this with professional writers, but we've also done it with readers of fiction. So to take the latter first, we asked readers of fiction, do they ever, when they're reading a book, do they hear the voices of the characters in their heads? And just as you'd expect, there's a huge variation. So we found in our sample, like 1 in 7 of the readers said that hearing the voice of the character in a book was as real and lifelike and vivid as if there'd been an actual person in the room with them.
Wow.
And that's got some press coverage. And of course, the paper said 1 in 7 people hear the voices of the characters as if they're a real person. But of course, the other side of that is that 6 in 7 don't. So it is a minority of people who are having that really rich, vivid experience of voice hearing. We asked these people, some of them then responded in greater depth to say more about these experiences. And we uncovered some interesting phenomena about the sort of crossover between real and fictional worlds. And my favorite is one that my colleague Marco Benini called Experiential Crossing. And this is the best example of this is that somebody's reading Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. They're rereading it, in fact, and I think maybe studying it for a class. They put the book down, they go out to the flat, down into the street to get a coffee. They walk into Starbucks, but instead of seeing the inside of Starbucks as they themselves would experience it, they're experiencing it as Mrs. Dalloway, as the character in this book that they've been reading. And I've had this, it was great when we picked up on this, because I've had this experience a lot. I still have it when I'm reading something that I'm really taken by, a feeling like I'm entering that mindset as a character, that I'm becoming that character in some way. But the interesting thing here is it's one thing to be doing that whilst you're sitting down with a book, but then to be taking that out into the world with you in your everyday interaction is something else again. So there's something going on with readers of fiction in terms of the way they take on the voices of characters that they're reading about. And this might just be a kind of specific kind of inner speech. That might be the best way of describing it. As far as the writers are concerned, we asked a group of writers who were passing through an international book festival this question of whether they actually hear the voices of their characters. And again, as you'd expect, huge variation. I think the press probably wanted us to pin down some special psychological detail that made a writer a writer. Sorry, we weren't going to do that. We didn't expect to do that, and we didn't do that. We showed instead that there was a huge amount of variation. But I think the most, one thing to take away from those findings is that for writers, it isn't like an intrusive voice addressing you, commanding you, because in order to make it work as a writer, you kind of need that not to happen. You need to be off the scene. You need to be kind of in control, but not part of the action. And in fact, the most common description that we found was of writers describing it not like hearing the voices, but more like overhearing the voices, more like eavesdropping on a conversation. And I write fiction myself, and I have exactly this experience that I need to hear my characters speaking, but I don't hear them speaking to me, and I don't really want them speaking to me, because I want them to be speaking to each other, and I want to be picking up on what they're saying to each other. And there's only one exception to that, where I felt that two of my characters were actually speaking directly to me, and it felt quite strange. It felt like a bit of a glitch in the system. It wasn't quite supposed to be like that.
Right. Can I give you I find this so fascinating. I had a conversation with your colleague, Ben Alderson-Day, and I loved this. I thought it was so cool. But I have a hypothesis that for this that I want to run by you and get your thoughts on. So I'm a big fan of predictive processing accounts of the brain, right? So the brain sits in its black box, and it's really trying to figure out the causes of these sensory signals that it's receiving. And if you're a writer and you're putting all this emotion into a character, and you're writing this story, and you're so engaged, and you're as you create this character, your brain is also getting all of this information. And the best way it can maybe make sense of all of this information about this character that has, again, since you're writing it, there's so much emotion, there's so much intensity maybe to your relationship with that character, that the best explanation it has for all of that data is possibly that it is another self. And then your social modeling infrastructure is kind of like kicked up into gear there, and it's actually simulating this like it's another self. It's maybe part of your social infrastructure, because that's just the best explanation for having all this emotion about something. Like, what else could it be if the brain didn't really? Well, it's actually an interesting question if the brain evolved with writing, but you can say that probably quite a lot of the brain's evolution, writing didn't exist. So maybe the only way all of this information would come into the brain about a character is if it was a real person out there. I'm curious if you think that has any basis at all, or so maybe sort of fits the idea, because I think it's an interesting one. Obviously, it's a hypothesis. It sort of makes sense to me.
It could explain why people become writers, why they feel they've got these books inside them that they need to set down. I think the actual process of writing a new novel is a bit more deliberate, in that you have an idea for a story, and you start to shape the characters, and you have themes you want to explore, and you don't shape the characters, they sort of come to you, in my experience anyway. I think what you described actually, I think, fits better with hypothesis that we've had about children's imaginary friends. So the puzzle of why a third to 2/3 of regular kids have these imaginary companions. And I've hypothesized that could, and you can make sense of this in terms of a predictive processing argument. You can actually make sense of anything in terms of a predictive processing argument. It's just a different framework for understanding how the mind works. It's not a theory. It's a different, like the computer metaphor was a useful way of thinking about how the mind works. The predictive processing is the same to my mind. But anyway, I think that would be a useful way of thinking about how young children start to engage with these imaginary, if you like, fictional companions. And it's very common, and it's used to be associated with negative mental health outcomes, but it's not now, thankfully. But if you think about, again, going back to Vygotsky and that process of internalizing voices, the young child's mind is going to be a pretty strange place to be in terms of all these different voices, all these bits of dialogue in the process of being assimilated, being taken into the self, all this learning going on, all these new experiences. And there we've actually hypothesized that creating an imaginary companion might be a way of reifying these kind of semi-digested social dialogues that kids are taking into themselves to form their own inner speech. And maybe when we know that adults continue to have imaginary companions, maybe are engaging with imaginary companions, with fictional characters, with game characters, with tulpas, spiritual beings, maybe all of that is just a sort of long distance hangover from what was going on when we were small children.
The Giant Shoulder mission is to explore radical ideas in biology, neuroscience, and consciousness, and elevate those stories to the highest possible level while keeping them accessible to everyone. If this interests you and you want to support independent science, then please consider subscribing to the Clips channel